Contains scenes of historical violence and references to sexual assault. Viewer discretion advised. He burst the door through as if the hinges were enemies. Lamplight spilled across a narrow room and caught 3 faces at once. A woman with her hair undone, a man whose chest rose and fell like a bellows, and the farmer, Colonel Ramiro, standing in the doorway with a machete clutched against the wood. The metal gleamed weakly. Sweat shone on his temple. For a second there was only the sound of breathing and the slow, obscene dragging of linen. The sight knocked the breath out of him. He had imagined 100 affronts, none that quieted the world like this one. Clara turned, fingers flinching toward the thin sheet. Zé sat up, the room still full of the smell of smoke and cooking oil, the faint iron of the machete like a promise in the air. Time narrowed to the space between blade and throat, between accusation and reply. Everyone expected a blade. No one expected what he did next. If you love intense historical twists, hit subscribe. More stories like this every week. Ramiro left the machete where it lay against the doorframe. He did not strike. Instead, he moved with the slow, terrible composure of a man who measures consequences before anger. That was his practice all his life. Land appraised, cattle counted, reputations weighed. Outrage could be allowed to burn, but only if it served a purpose. His jaw tightened, not from the violence of the moment, but from calculation. Humiliation could be worse than blood. A rumor could travel to 100 barrios and cut a man from his standing in ways a wound never could. Clara was his wife by name, and by an old arrangement that had bound the two together more by ledger than by intimacy. She had married into a house where daylight was ledgered, and nights were for bearing heirs and quiet obedience. Behind her polite speech lay a hunger the estate could not satisfy. Loneliness settled around her like the dust of the road. Zé was not innocent of that loneliness. He was, in fact, a man full of contradictions. He had been bought young, molded by labor, made invaluable by a body that the plantation tested like soil. The other slaves called him Zé Grande, for the way he could lift a fallen beam single-handed, for how he hauled loads that buckled men half his age. Maria, the cook, watched both Clara and Zé with a careful silence that had the softness of someone who kept secrets like bread. Life on the farm was a collection of small violences. The whip in the morning, the ledger at night, the way the sun made the red earth steal a man's strength by noon. Ramiro ran it as if the plantation itself were a being that could be disciplined. He prized land, bloodline, the neatness of inheritance. Reputation was currency. To have his wife found in an embrace with a slave was not simply a private betrayal. It touched the ledger of lineage, threatened the order he had spent decades building.
Zé had been the best of the laborers and the most careful of survivors. He had learned when to lower his head and when to stand so square that a man bumped against him and wondered if he had been there before. He did not court trouble. He had held his hands open to the sun and closed them only on the work he was given. But there had been small friendships between Zé and Clara that were never meant for the eyes of the house. A shared laugh at dawn, a hand on the same bowl of rice, a look that lingered too long. Those sparks became ash in the room that night, but ash can still carry heat. Dawn arrived with the sound of the bell from the chapel and the hoarse calls of men who came to see spectacle disguised as justice. Ramiro had given the order before the sun fully opened its eye. The pillory was set in the terrero at the heart of the plantation, the place where women hung laundry, where blacksmith smoke mingled with the children's games, where the master's carriage left its deep tracks. They dragged Zé out, ropes biting his wrists. Clara was made to stand with a scarf over her head. Villagers arrived from the nearby settlement, not merely to watch, but to be reminded of the rules that kept land in the hands of men like Ramiro. The crowd's faces were a low thrum of expectation. Some had loved the farmer, some had feared him, many had accepted the farm's order as the measure of the world. Capataces barked orders, children were hushed, a priest loitered at the edge, his presence a thin veneer of sanctity over an exercise of power. Ramiro climbed the small bench that had been set for him, the machete at his side like a totem. His voice carried without shouting. He spoke in short, surgical sentences that cut like a saw. He listed transgressions in a cold, civic tone, acts of dishonor, of fixity, of disorder that could not be left unaddressed. The crowd leaned in. He called down the ritual of punishment that would make the sin visible to all, the lash, public scorn, the record of misbehavior inked into memory. But after he had spoken, after the whisper of horrors and property had rustled through the crowd, he stopped the man who was carrying the whip. The whip stayed in the air as if the world itself had held its breath, and then he wiped his palm on his coat and said, "Enough." What followed was theater. He would not spill Zé's blood in front of witnesses, he said, but he would not let the matter pass. He pivoted from punishment to proposition. To the murmurs he offered a path that no one in the yard could have predicted, freedom on the condition of service and continuity.
"Zé will be free," he announced, and the words struck the ground like a thrown stone. The crowd reacted, first with disbelief, then with a thin, quick envy from some, with a deeper, slower suspicion from others. But he must take up a new name as head of labor here, marry Clara, and be recognized as the capataz. He must sire a child to carry my name into the earth of this estate.
Only then will the pact be sealed, and then his freedom will be real. Until then, he remains under laws and oaths. It was clemency wrapped in chains. In one breath, Ramiro stripped honor and gave it back with conditions that kept the farm's heart beating in the same rhythm. The offer did not free Zé so much as entangle him in new obligations. To the farmer, it was shrewd. He retained territorial control, potentially gained a legitimate bloodline, and turned scandal into a new kind of asset. To the spectators, it looked like magnanimity. To Zé and Clara, it was a crossroads with no good direction. Zé felt the world tilt beneath him. Freedom spoken by a man with a ledger still meant another kind of ownership. To be free on paper was one thing. To be bound to a woman he had loved under the gaze of the man who owned him was another. Clara's eyes were full of pleading that did not reach him. She had not imagined a bargain. She had only imagined a soft space away from the coldness of her marriage. Now she saw herself traded into another form of confinement. White linen exchanged for a ring that would symbolize a bargain struck under duress. There was fear and calculation in Zé's mind at once. Refuse, and Ramiro's men would find ways to instruct the world with pain. Accept, and a different kind of life might open. A legal name, a small house by the plantation, the title of capataz that would place him between labor and power. Freedom could be built from within a cage if one knew how to dig. He had seen other men navigate narrow corridors and find holes they could widen. So he accepted. The wedding was a hollow thing held beneath the same sun that had seen his breaking. A scribe wrote the alforria, words inked with the cool hand of legal ritual. The priest murmured blessings that sounded almost ridiculous in the face of chains that had only just been loosened. There were witnesses who signed names in a book that would sit for years in a drawer, the paper a thin testament to a freedom that was as much political performance as emancipation. Clara walked in a dress purchased for the show. Her face was carefully arranged in the way that women of her station learned, but her eyes were a different geography. There were places in them that did not belong to the room. She and Zé were married by compulsion, their bodies and names united in a way that pleased the farmer's sense of order. Ramiro watched like a man who had laid a trap and expected the quarry to perform a script. The home they were given was small and near the barns. In it, Zé learned the strange rhythms of a man newly free yet watched. He was allowed to purchase certain things. He could sign for small sums, call laborers to task. But the memory of rope at his wrists lived in his muscles, and the farmer's presence hovered like a roof over both of them. Clara moved through the rooms like someone learning to use hands that had forgotten touch.
The intimacy they had been punished for remained complicated. What had once been a reprieve from loneliness now carried the aftertaste of coercion. Maria, in the kitchen, became a confidant in the narrow hours. She kept out of sight for most matters, but she had a way of setting a bowl on the table at exactly the moment a silence could not hold any longer. She had escaped the worst visibility of the house by becoming indispensable in a different space, and she used that worth to pass messages, to hide small coins, to ferry seeds and words toward a horizon outside the farm. Zé began almost immediately to think of leaving. But he knew leaving required more than courage. It required a network. Quilombos, those hidden settlements springing up in the forest beyond the hills, had been a rumor in many mouths and a fact for others. They were places where those who fled slavery banded together, raising children in freedom and working the land on different terms. Quilombos were dangerous to reach and dangerous to resist, yet they offered the possibility of forging a life on one's own terms. At night, after the lamps had guttered, Zé met with others who shared his longing. They passed the small hours trading news, listening for the cadence of convoys, measuring the farmers' patrols, noting how the guards slept. They learned the farmers' rounds and the rhythm of the capataz's inspections. Maria knitted a map in her knotted hands, hiding it in the hem of a cloth. It had the soft, careful markings of someone who had seen both sides of life, the kitchen's hearth and the farm's ledger.
Clara's role was more uncertain. She bore the marks of regret and duty. Some nights she sobbed into a pillow and begged for a kind of absolution that could not be granted. Other nights she walked the plantation's edge and watched the horizon as if the sea were the thing she had lost. She carried within her the child that would complicate everything she and Zé had built, the tiny life that was both an anchor and a key. Pregnancy hardened her resolve in ways that fear had not. It made decisions more layered. It turned private hunger into a public question of what she owed herself and what she owed the child. The escape was not a single romantic flight, but a patient unraveling. Zé and a handful of trusted men marked a night when the moon was small and the farmer's men drank too much at the village festival. They waited until the last lantern flickered and a dog began its habitual round. They moved through cane and scrub, silent as ghosts. Maria had left a small break in the fence and a cloak with another name sewn on the inside. The courier from the Quilombo, an old man with eyes like flint, met them at the tree line with a handout. There was fear in every step. Every twig snapped like accusation. They reached the Quilombo not as conquerors, but as supplicants. They brought stories of scars and hunger, of a bargain that had been half a release and half a sentence.
The ones who welcomed them were not naive to the dangers of harboring fugitives. They were themselves the architects of a kind of social experiment that had nothing to do with the farmer's ledger. The Quilombo was rough-hewn, made of labor and laughter stitched to the margin of the world. They cleared land, built houses, sent children to learn through stories and hard work. It was an adult's paradise of necessity. No one had titles, everyone had duties. Years condensed and changed Zé. The muscles that had been honed under a master's whack now belonged to a man who chose where to aim them. He taught the boys to carry beams and the women to plant in lines. He argued in meetings about how to allocate water. He became a leader not by decree, but by competence and kindness. The child Clara had borne grew in the shade of freedom, learning a language of self-possession. The memory of the plantation receded like a painful scar that had been touched and then given a bandage. But freedom did not erase the past. The farm remained a place that exhaled power, and news traveled as steadily as the river. The man who had been Colonel Ramiro grew older and tasted the rust of years. The newspaper of the region muttered about debts and the sale of land. When Ramiro died, it was only a matter of months before the land that had seemed eternal was parceled out. Buyers came with ledgers of their own, but the idea that property could last forever was a fiction that died with him. When the farm was sold, Zé did not return to claim anything he had been forced into. The bargain Ramiro had struck was old, and the Alforria papers, once a tool of humiliation and coercion, were now documents that lost their usefulness to the living. The children who had been born under the farmer's watch lived away from the earth that had first seen their breaths. They were not the heirs Ramiro had imagined when he traded a man's body for a name. They were something else, small claims to a story retold on a different register. In the later years, Zé, no longer Zé Grande, but a man known simply by the trade he had chosen and the people he had raised, sat under an orange tree and told the story in the cadence of someone who had weathered more than he had desired. His hair had gone white at the temples, lines had ripened at the corners of his eyes. His children and grandchildren gathered, souls dusty, faces tilted toward his voice. He did not deliver grand moral judgments. He did not speak of forgiveness as if it were a balm he had a monopoly on. Instead, he told the truth, of being seen, of being owned, of being paraded, and then given the possibility of release that was still shrouded in power. He described the choice he had made, not because it was noble in itself, but because at the time it was the pathway that allowed survival and eventually a chance to crawl out of the shadow of the plantation. When a man's honor and a slave's life collide, he'd say, the law is only a backdrop.
What you do when the lights are on is different from what you do when they're off. His chest did not swell with righteous triumph. Rather, his voice carried the weight of someone who had learned cunning must accompany courage. He spoke of Clara in a manner that complicated fondness and critique. She had been both victim and actor, someone who had sought solace and stumbled into complicity. Her choices had been made in a space where options were few and consequences were many. She had loved and erred and saved and betrayed in ways that made moralizing useless. In time, they had forged a strange peace. Not an affluence of affection, but a quiet settlement that let children grow and let the past be named without giving it power over the future.
Zé's grandchildren played in the yard with no knowledge of the pillory's precise shape. They climbed the orange tree and scraped their knees, and argued over which story grandfather favored. They would remember the name of a place far away, where an old man had once wielded a machete and left decisions in the mouths of others. They would inherit not the farce of a patriarch's will, but the steady work the community had built from days of secrecy and nights of plan. When people told the story at the market or by the river, they often began where the spectacle had been clearest: the night in the room, the blade, the shock. But after the retelling, a second truth settled: that the most dangerous surprises are not the ones of pure malice, but the ones of calculation. Ramiro's reaction had been unexpected, because it was not a bloody spectacle, but a settled bargain. It rearranged lives not with a blade, but with a pen. That was a cruelty of another sort. The final image, as the light leaned downhill and the year edged toward a slow winter, was of Zé sitting with a pipe in his hands, gray in the beard, voice low. He had no triumphalism. He had only the plain claim of survival and work. We lived. We made ourselves. That is enough. The grandchildren listened and then ran off to some unremarkable game. The land beyond their houses stretched, and where the plantation had once risen like a spine of authority, a different colony of houses and fields quilted the space. People tilled the soil and paid no one for their labor but themselves. Ramiro's death had dissolved once immovable things. The barn where punishment had been meted was old, the ropes rotted. The pillory's hole had been filled in by time and roots. Papers that once authorized a life had become meaningless scraps in a new economic order. Zé did not seek vengeance. He had used the farmer's bargain as a lever. He turned the lever into a fulcrum. The choice he had made in the face of a machete and an angry man had not been heroic in the tidy sense, but it had been effective. It allowed him to live, to flee, to build, and to raise children who could write their own ledgers.
There is a cruelty in the way power disguises itself as mercy, and a stubborn hope in the way people translate mercy into freedom. The farmer thought he had kept the world as it was. Instead, he set into motion a chain that unknotted his own legacy and remade the lives he meant to control. That kind of irony is not a neat justice, but sometimes life is built of such narrow human reckonings. If this story moved you, like and share. Subscribe for more real stories that stick with you.